Welcome folks who are coming into the room now. This is a virtual space, obviously, that you're in. This space is a collaboration between Green Acre, which is a Baha'i Center of Learning, and the Baha'i Publishing Trust. My name is Jessica Gaines, and I serve as the program coordinator here at Green Acre on the banks of the beautiful Piscataqua River in Elliott, Maine, homeland of the Abenaki people. We are honored to collaborate with the Baha'i Publishing Trust to bring you programming on a fairly regular basis that features really stellar authors. One of them is here with us today. My friend Atafe will be introducing him shortly. So the Universal House of Justice wrote that centers of learning, such as Green Acre, the distinctive contribution that we really can make is to bring the Baha'i teachings to bear on issues of the day and areas of study, such as the environment, wealth and poverty, and to really create discourse spaces. And we hope that today's talk can fill that role a little bit. Today's presentation will last approximately an hour, and at the end we'll have about 30 minutes for Q&A. If during this presentation you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor, you'll see several icons down there. One's the chat icon. We highly encourage you to share your thoughts, your reactions, your hellos in that chat box. We love hearing people's reactions to things that Paul is going to share with us today. And then if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A box, which is just a couple icons over. Because if you put it in the chat box, we often lose it because there's a lot of conversation that often happens. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Atafe from the Baha'i Publishing Trust.
So hi, everyone. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of the Baha'i Publishing Trust and the Green Acre. We are very fortunate to have Mr. Paul Hanley presenting this very timely and important subject. Abdu'l-Bahá's solution to the global food crisis begin with the village. We would like to take a few moments to introduce Paul, even though most of the friends here know him and have read his books. Paul Hanley has published 5 books and over 1,600 articles on the environment, sustainable development, agriculture, and other topics. He is editor and co-author of Earth Care. His book 11 received the 2015 University of Saskatchewan President's Award for Nonfiction and the 2015 Association for Baha'i Studies Award for Distinguished Scholarship. Paul's biography, Man of the Trees, Richard St. Barbe Baker, the first global conservationist, features a foreword by His Royal Highness Prince Charles, an introduction by Jane Goodall. Paul's latest book is Richard St. Barbe Baker, Child of the Trees, part of the Changemaker series from Bellwood Press, which is under the umbrella of the Baha'i Publishing Trust, and it is aimed at junior youth. To understand a little bit more about Paul's passion for the environment, I will read the dedication in that book. For my grandchildren, Emma, Sabri, and Ingrid, with the hope that their grandchildren will be able to enjoy the world's forests. I think that tells a lot. Paul is a recipient of the Canadian Environment Award, the Miwasin Conservation Award, the Organic Connections Pioneer Organic Communicator Award, and the Saskatchewan Sustainability Award for the Regional Center of Excellence for Education on Sustainable Development. In 2020, Paul received the Food System 2050 Vision Prize Award. Please join me in welcoming Paul. And just for your information, Paul lives in Hawaii and he has some roosters. So we might have some background guests also in the talk. Please, Paul.
Thank you, Atafe and Jessica, and thanks for inviting me to Green Acre. I've never been to Green Acre, and of course would love to be there someday in person. Check it all out. It's a very fabled location for Baha'is, where I believe Abdu'l-Bahá went to it at one time. So yeah, I'm really pleased to be here and share some of these ideas about the teachings of the faith about agriculture and how important that is today, especially with all the news that's coming out about the conditions of the world and the fires that are burning, the droughts, the floods, and so many troubling developments almost wherever you go. And just before we started, we were talking about, I pioneered recently to Hawaii, and it was, people often say, oh, wow, you've gone to paradise and so on, but it's, come and check it out. It's not quite that way. Although everywhere you go in the world is got some elements of paradise as well. So I'm going to start by sharing a slideshow. So yeah, I was asked to talk about this theme, Abdu'l-Bahá's solution to the global food crisis, and beginning with the village. So I'll just try to contextualize this a little bit at the beginning here. And so let's just sort of consider what the central figures of the faith were involved in at the time they were living in Persia. And I rely a lot here on the papers that have been written by the Baha'i scholar and agronomist Iraj Pushti. And he has really described and contextualized the agricultural discourse and activities of the central figures of the faith, Abdu'l-Bahá in particular. And Pushti explains that the peasantry of Persia and the Ottoman Empire endured appalling conditions in the 19th century. Fully aware of and even enduring some of these hardships, the central figures of the faith, the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Bahá, assigned an important station to farmers and food producers, who are destined to play a significant role in the world order prescribed by Baha'u'llah. Agriculture and farming conditions in Persia had remained much the same for centuries, notes Pushti. The Bab and Baha'u'llah were in constant contact with farmers, peasants, serfs, sharecroppers, landlords, and owners of large estates, as well as the tribesmen, tribal chiefs, and communities who provided the bulk of the meat and the dairy products for the nation. And he goes on, for almost 3,000 years, the village had been the base unit and backbone for the social, political, cultural, religious, and economic life into which the farming community and rural population of Persia was organized. Its socioeconomic structure was made up of the landowning nobility, whose large estates were supported almost entirely on rents and profits from the farmlands occupied by peasants and sharecroppers. The peasant status was so low that a classical Persian text has stated that the earth and the very dust of the ground mean more to the lords than did the cultivators who toiled upon it. The surface of the truckways, said the Confessions, does not receive such beatings as do the serfs. In common with their counterparts in Persia, the Arab peasantry of Iraq, Jordan, Syria, and Palestine, where the central figures were exiled, were also exposed to rapacious, profiteering landlords. The central figures understood the grinding poverty of rural people and had a keen interest in the toils of the men, women, and children who, in the unrelenting heat of summer and the paralyzing cold of winter, tilled the land and produced crops and animal products. So just something on the involvement of the central figures of the faith in agriculture and rural life. So Baha'u'llah had himself spent 36 years in Persia, at times actively engaged in the administration, management, and even routine operation of his father's estates on the outskirts of Tehran, as well as in the village of Takur in the district of Nur in the province of Mazandaran. Although Baha'u'llah came from a wealthy and prominent family of landowners, he did not exploit the peasants under his care. It's also notable that Baha'u'llah's family owned slaves, and when Baha'u'llah took took over control from his father when his father passed, one of the first things he did, which I believe was in 1837, was free the slaves that were owned by his family. Now, as a child, Abdu'l-Bahá sometimes accompanied his father during his farm activities. Then, when only 8 years of age, he accompanied Baha'u'llah into exile in Iraq. In the coming years, notes Pushti, he would develop a deep-rooted interest in the wide knowledge of the agrarian structures of the 19th century Middle East. His contribution of detailed procedures for the development of agriculture and that of rural areas are original, unique, and immense. And even when on his travels in America, Abdu'l-Bahá often spoke about agricultural development. His ongoing interest in this issue was demonstrated, for example, in his visit to the agricultural fair in Salt Lake City in Utah. He toured the fair accompanied by its president and was offered samples of vegetables, fruits, and flowers, and a number of these caught his attention, and he instructed that seeds be purchased for the grounds of the Baha'i shrines in Haifa. He took note of farm implements and irrigation equipment and obtained information on methods of use and costs, and praised the progress of agriculture in the United States. Agriculture and the world of nature also supplied many of the metaphors Abdu'l-Bahá used to illustrate his teachings of Baha'u'llah. For example, at the time of the fair in Salt Lake City, he told one of the reporters who had come to hear him that, as I arrived in town, I found great bustling and activity. I asked what was the event. I was told the agricultural fair was on. Abdu'l-Bahá then said that Baha'u'llah had also organized an agricultural fair in Persia. The difference is that your agricultural fair is worldly, but Baha'u'llah's fair is divine. In this agricultural fair, many dignified persons are gathered, and thus their affection is earthly. But in Baha'u'llah's fair are gathered holy souls who irrigate the lands of hearts with eternal life-giving water, and their affection is celestial. This agricultural fair is illumined with earthly lights. That agricultural fair's illumination are heavenly. As I compared these two agricultural fairs, I became very happy and pray that God provide abundant harvests for your cultivation and grant potential for eternal life and spiritual disposition. So agriculture and nature are often used in the Baha'i writings by the central figures to raise awareness of spiritual things as well. So in 1891, Baha'u'llah outlined some ideas that he had, some concepts and principles for, as he said, the advancement of mankind and the reconstruction of the world. And he talked about 5 principles for the administration of human affairs. And these were international cooperation and disarmament, a new ethos of universal fellowship, the adoption of a common auxiliary language, the training and education of children, and lastly, he mentioned agricultural development. But then, interestingly, he said, a special regard must be paid to agriculture as, in quotes, unquestionably, it precedes the other principles in importance. And perhaps this is why Baha'i writings also stated that agricultural work is identical with worship. So Baha'u'llah had laid a kind of foundation in this tablet and others for the concept of the centrality of agriculture in his world order. And I've done a bit of a study of the writings over the years, looking at, what are the different ideas and concepts and principles. Don't worry that you can't read this. We won't go into all the details, but I just wanted to show you, I found 115 different concepts, principles, and so on that are relevant to agriculture in the Baha'i writings, the writings of the Bab, Baha'u'llah, and Abdu'l-Bahá, as well as the Guardian. And these concepts, I think, are not meant to be kind of a prescription for how agriculture should operate, although there are definitely elements there that are prescriptive, but basically they're concepts, principles, spiritual concepts, and material concepts that will guide people in the future, whether individual farmers, producers, or even consumers, or policymakers, agronomists, and so on, in building a kind of just and sustainable agricultural system in the future. Just to just zero in a little bit, when I was building that systems map of Baha'i teachings on this, I kind of organized them into 4 basic concepts. And these kind of build around this idea of that there are 3 sort of groups of protagonists that are engaged in a transformative process and building this new world order that Baha'u'llah has prescribed. There's the individual, and so the whole process of building individual capacity pertains to agriculture in many ways, and there's different factors around even diet and so on that help to build this individual capacity as people develop their abilities, but also learn how to become servants of the community. There's also the question of institutions, so these ideas around building a just and equitable world order, around concepts around distribution of wealth, the balance between different nations and so on, and building global food systems. And a lot of it, though, is focused around this idea of building unified and prosperous communities. And here's where Abdu'l-Bahá often talked about the idea of beginning with the village, and how the village was a very kind of foundational community in global society. But I want to suggest that maybe there's a 4th partner in this process, and that is the planet itself. So this concept of sustaining the ecosphere is part of this process of building an ever-advancing civilization that has a kind of centrality of agriculture involved, is also very significant and is talked a lot about in the writings. So just to focus in a little bit on more on these areas around building unified communities, the development processes begin with the village and among the primary producers, which class, the farming class, is identified as of primary importance. And agricultural work itself is elevated to a form of worship. And spiritual and material practices are identified to aid in building unified communities. Emphasis is placed on universal education. Key roles are provided for women and youth, and measures to ensure the elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty are identified. In terms of building individual capacity for service, the Training Institute is identified as a means for developing a 2-fold moral purpose: to build individual capacity and capacities for service. Individual capacity involves attainment of virtues and modes of conduct. Measures to improve health and nutrition also support individual development. With regard to building a just and equitable world order, critical elements are fostering consciousness of the oneness of humanity, a focus on the welfare of humanity, global interdependence, demilitarization, and nonpartisan model for local and national and global governance, achieving equitable social wealth through wealth creation and redistribution, and the amelioration of market forces and fair trade. And in terms of sustainability of agroecosystems, key concepts are the identification of sustainability as actually a spiritual principle, the conception of nature as sacred, the importance of biodiversity, the articulation of the rights of nature and justice for all species, the idea of limiting material growth, a special role assigned to people as trustees of the ecosphere, and the advancement of agriculture as a noble science. So let's go now to focus in on our exemplar, Abdu'l-Bahá, and how he was, well, we call him the master, but he was really a master of all of these components of moving forward with the development of a sustainable civilization. So he really was a master of building capacity in individuals, in people and communities, and also in the areas of public discourse and social action. So I'd like to just sort of go through exactly how he participated in this process and focused his attention and discourse and action on agriculture. So, of course, he was really unparalleled in achievements in public discourse. And I often think of this idea of 30,000 tablets that he wrote, because I'm a writer myself. And I think in the introduction, it mentioned that I had written 15 or 1,600 articles. That was over a 27-year period where I was writing one article every week. But I realized that that is really not that significant compared to Abdu'l-Bahá. And it would, if I had written, instead of one article a week, if I'd written an article every weekday, it would take me 108 years to produce 30,000 tablets. So it's really, just that in itself is really remarkable. And of course, we have to realize that each of these tablets are, many of them, some of them are just letters to friends and so on, but many of them are, of course, tremendously profound. And at the same time, Abdu'l-Bahá had written 3 books. Of course, The Secret of Divine Civilization is one that is quite pertinent to this discussion of agriculture. In addition to that, there's his verbal discourse, which have been collected. And of course, one of the wonderful things about this dispensation is that it has been possible, because we're in the modern era, to very carefully collect all of these writings and utterances. And so earlier I mentioned that he had traveled, and often during his travels, he did speak about agriculture, different principles for rural development and so on, for village development were brought up. And very often touched on things like agriculture. But he was also a master of this area of social action as well. So in his personal life, he was often described as the Lord of Generosity. So his personal activities in care of the poor and disadvantaged in Akka, where he lived, and in Haifa, providing financial support, feeding and bathing the sick. The Arabs called him the Lord of Generosity. He goes about doing good, and Mohammedans and Christians alike share his benefactions. From sunrise often till midnight he works, in spite of broken health, never sparing himself if there is a wrong to be righted or a suffering to be relieved. So in Iran, he fostered the social development of the community. He encouraged the Baha'is to set up schools and medical facilities, and promoted the role of women in the community. He also promoted the development of cooperatives and other businesses in the field of agriculture and food systems. And he also encouraged the development of the Baha'i community of Ashgabat in Turkmenistan. And it was freer to develop distinctively Baha'i community life. And here Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged the Baha'is to set up a number of institutions, schools, a clinic, a traveler's hospice, a library and reading room, and public baths. These all culminated in the building between 1902 and 1919 of the first Mashriq al-Adkar of the Baha'i world. With Abdu'l-Bahā's encouragement, the Baha'is of Ashgabat attained as close as was possible to achieve at that time the ideal of a Baha'i community. Now, let's consider that all of these activities that he was engaged in, from the age of 9 to 64, he was an exile and a prisoner, much of the time under constant threat of execution. At the same time, continuous efforts were made to undermine his authority by members of his family who were jealous. So all of these accomplishments that I've mentioned so far were in addition to things like receiving all the pilgrims. Often he would cook for them himself. He was building the Shrine of the Bab, creating the world center of the Baha'i faith, actively engaged in beautification of the shrines, and also as the head of the world faith, administering an emerging world religion and its expansion throughout the world. And during his ministry, the Baha'i faith spread to Australia, New Zealand, China, Japan, South Africa, South America, and the islands in the Pacific. And then on top of all that, there was managing government relations. So he was working with authorities within his own communities. So really remarkable human being on all levels. So on top of that, I want to focus in now on the work he did in building a model village in Adessia. And Adessia is a small community in Jordan. And I'm again relying on Iraj Pushti, who wrote a wonderful article describing this remarkable accomplishment of Abdu'l-Bahá of building a model village, which I think today is very relevant to the interest that people around the world are developing in food security and food sovereignty. And so we have a wonderful model here that we can work with. So in 1901, Abdu'l-Bahá purchased the lands of Adessia as a whole village estate, paying 400 Turkish golden lira. The original area purchased was 920 hectares. However, Abdu'l-Bahá immediately gave away 230 hectares, leaving a total of 690 hectares. And I think a hectare is not quite 2 acres. So this would be something like 1,500 acres, if you're more familiar with that system. And the village was developed in several phases. At first, Abdu'l-Bahá made arrangements for several farmers to begin the work, but they found it very difficult due to the poor conditions of the land and the heavy labor required. What is more, they were subject to raids by thieves who stole whatever meager crops they were able to produce. In 1907, recognizing these obstacles, Abdu'l-Bahá contacted the Baha'is in Persia and asked them to send experienced farmers to settle Adessia. So these maps are just here to give you an idea where this community is. You see what Akka and Haifa over on the coast, and then you see the Sea of Galilee, Tiberias, and so on in the center. And we'll zero in a little bit here. So just south and a little bit east of the Sea of Galilee is the location of the village of Adessia in modern Jordan. And that's the community today. And you can see all the farmland around it. Now, the work in these areas of Jordan would actually receive the blessings of Baha'u'llah. And you'll see in the gleanings from the writings of Baha'u'llah, he talks about leave hath moreover been given to whosoever may desire to raise throughout the length and breadth of this land noble and imposing structures and dedicate the rich and sacred territories adjoining the Jordan and its vicinity to the worship and service of the one true God. So in fact, there were a number of villages that were started by the Baha'i friends, including Baha'u'llah's brother, who started a village, but we'll focus in on, I think, as far as I know, the most successful of these was this one started by Abdu'l-Bahá. So I titled this slide, The Most Inhospitable Place on Earth. And Abdu'l-Bahá had called for the friends in Iran to come, but he was very transparent. And he told them that this was one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. And the friends started coming from Iran, from the area around Yazd, and began to commence farm operations. But things were difficult. In the Jordan Valley, the heat is stifling from June to September, with an average daily temperature around 38 degrees Celsius. Malaria was a significant problem. While the lands had once been fertile and supported a large population, agriculture in the region had fallen into decline under Ottoman rule. Abdu'l-Bahá had told them that God would gradually make the climate of Adessia more comfortable, merely for the sake of the Baha'i farmers from Iran. These farmers would overcome many obstacles to implement the projects planned and directed by Abdu'l-Bahá himself. At first, hand labor with simple tools were used to prepare the land, but gradually draft animals and plows were added. They also had to build homes to provide for the basic needs of their families, and these and other buildings were initially made from mud bricks. Before the farmers started cultivation, Abdu'l-Bahá instructed them to meet, consult, and then divide the land among themselves. So gradually, the friends began to prosper. Precipitation was sufficient to support rain-fed grain production, and Abdu'l-Bahá recommended the farmers begin by planting wheat and barley. Often the farmers visited Haifa or Akka to speak directly to Abdu'l-Bahá to get his advice. He would make a specific recommendation for that season, assuring them of a bumper harvest and great bounty. An important characteristic of the Jordan Valley is a year-round growing season, making double cropping feasible. Over time, the farmers were able to become quite productive and to produce surplus grain. Although some raiding continued to occur, security was improved by building bonds of friendship in the wider community, an activity Abdu'l-Bahá had insisted on. So now this is the aspect of the story that probably most of the Baha'is are familiar with. During the First World War, when drought conditions added to the disruption caused by the fighting, Abdu'l-Bahá foresaw famine. He went to the farmers in Adessia and asked them to empty their granaries, accepting the amounts needed for their own use and for reseeding. He also asked them to purchase grain from farmers in the area. A train of 200 camels was dispatched to Haifa and Akka, where the grain was distributed among the local population, preventing starvation. This humanitarian effort resulted in Abdu'l-Bahá being knighted by the British, who had gained control of Palestine during the war. He accepted the honor as a gift of a just king, but never used the title himself. And this is a picture of the ceremony where he was knighted in 1920. So the farmers' initial success opened new horizons. Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged them to diversify their crops, and as early as 1910, they expanded into vegetable production for their families and for the market. Next, Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged the farmers to add fruit trees. It was customary to plant broad beans between and around pomegranate trees. Some were used fresh or dried for human consumption, but a large part of the crop was plowed into the soil while still green to improve soil texture and fertility. Abdu'l-Bahá also introduced bananas to the region. Until that time, no one in the region knew anything about this crop, let alone how to grow it. At first, the villagers were even unsure how to eat it, finding it quite unpalatable and hard to swallow, until they're shown that the outer skin must be removed. Within a few years, many farmers in the region had grown bananas and profited greatly from this relatively lucrative business. And gradually, Abdu'l-Bahā's prediction of improving conditions came true. In the early years, malaria was rampant. Some of the Baha'is developed the disease and even succumbed to it. To address the problem, Abdu'l-Bahá instructed the community to plant a certain type of eucalyptus around the lagoon in the middle of Adessia. This variety produces quinine in its leaves and branches, which acts as a deterrent to the malaria parasite. The trees grew quickly, sucking up large quantities of the mosquito-infested water. Along with the diversification of crops, Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged additional methods to improve the productivity and sustainability of the farms, such as crop rotation. In addition to the use of nitrogen-fixing legumes in rotation, manure was added to increase the yield of crops. Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged the friends in Adessia to diversify into livestock. The Baha'i farmers were almost self-sufficient in terms of their own food needs. However, Abdu'l-Bahá advised them to increase their income by selling products in markets beyond the immediate boundaries of Jordan. A key to increasing the diversity of crops and improving yields was irrigation. The community worked together to build a small dam across a portion of the river Yarmouk and collaborated to dig and maintain irrigation channels. Eventually, tractors and electric lighting were introduced. Abdu'l-Bahá advised the villagers to engage in crafts and small industries. Many farmers were also artisans, and a good number of them worked as part-time carpenters, while most of the women were engaged in needlework, dressmaking, and millinery. Along with the gradually improving farming operations, Abdu'l-Bahá encouraged spiritual and social aspects of village life. Problems such as those related to tenancy, transfer of the right of production, and share of irrigation water, as well as interpersonal conflicts, are bound to arise in any village setting. When the Baha'i farmers sought Abdu'l-Bahā's advice regarding these matters, he would smile and suggest that they should sit down and pray together, consult on the resolution of the problem, and ensure that the unity of the community was maintained no matter what. The conditions of peasant sharecroppers and the small farmers in 19th century Jordan under the rule of Ottoman Empire were wretched, as I mentioned earlier. The peasantry was liable to rapacious profiteering by landlords. Adessia was a different story. The system of crop and animal production was based on a special type of sharecropping tenancy that was both innovative and fair. Abdu'l-Bahá emphasized the application of moral and spiritual values in day-to-day life and farm work. These values had a significant influence in the production and marketing systems of the farmers, improving their fortunes. Furthermore, he strongly recommended they establish warm bonds with the people they met or had business dealings with, and conduct their affairs with high rectitude of conduct. In view of his great interest in rural and agricultural development, Abdu'l-Bahá would occasionally visit these villages. And this is a picture of the Hydroecology that was built in Adessia. Now this picture is from the 1940s. At its peak, there were around 1,000 people in the village of Adessia and surrounding areas. The first spiritual assembly of the Baha'is in Adessia was elected in 1924 to direct the affairs of the community. All matters relating to farming and animal production, including allotments of land, were discussed and conducted by a farming committee working under the auspices of the assembly. A spacious two-story building erected and completed in 1931 was dedicated for use as a local Baha'i administrative center, or Hydroecology. In the early days, the education of the children took place at home. In the evenings, the Baha'is, irrespective of age, attended literacy classes. And Adessia soon became an agricultural showplace for the whole of Jordan. If the government wished to show how advanced it was in agricultural production and farming techniques, it would bring foreign guests and dignitaries to Adessia, a brilliant star in the otherwise semi-arid scrubland. Even members of the royal family visited the village. However, ultimately, due to Jordanian land reforms in the 1960s, the Baha'is were not able to come to visit or continue to live in Adessia and move to other areas or even other countries to support the worldwide growth of the Baha'i faith. Now, this is an interesting thing, the possible influence of Adessia on the kibbutz movement in Israel. So you've probably heard of the kibbutz movement. And I was able to attend a virtual presentation by Dr. Shea Rosen, who is an Israeli researcher who's looked into the history of Adessia and the other Baha'i villages in Palestine and Jordan, and done some exploration of it. And so he feels that the kibbutz movement learned a lot from the Baha'is in Adessia. And here's just an example of the members of the Ein Gav kibbutz movement visiting El Adessia in 1941, and their description of it, which I'll just read because I think it's really quite interesting. It's slightly blocked, so I'll try and make my way through this. At the entrance of the village is a boulevard of acacia trees, to which are seen the various fruit tree gardens and beautiful vineyards. Most of the land is planted with gardens, an orchard of pomegranates of various varieties. We move to a vineyard. There are different varieties. Everything is arranged on cordons and beautifully processed. From here, we reach the fruit trees, pineapples, apples of all varieties, pears, guava. We saw bananas standing in 1/2 meter of water. In the orchard, there are 2 varieties of golden oranges, grapefruits, mandarins, lemons. In the corner of the farm, there is a cane and some vegetables. In conclusion, we saw here a perfect mixed farm. There are almost all the fruit trees. They came from Persia. They all make a living from farming. The foundation of their religion is horticulture. Talk about work as an ideal. Reminded us quite a bit of Aaron David Gordon. I think he's the founder of the kibbutz movement. We visited the club, which I think is the Hydroecology, a wonderful building surrounded by gardens and fruit trees and ornamental to glory. It is difficult to describe that in such a remote corner, there is such a wealth and beauty. So there's an outsider's observation of Adasiya and what was developed there. Abdu'l-Bahá, the principles and practices of village life and farming initiated by Abdu'l-Bahá in the village, I think still offer a relevant example. And we see, how the work that Abdu'l-Bahá did there in Akka and Haifa had this huge impact on the local community. This is a picture of the crowds that attended his funeral when he passed away in 1922, 100 years ago, or 1921, 100 years ago. And today, we have this shrine under construction to Abdu'l-Bahá, and reminding us of the wonderful work that he did in so many areas, including this area of agriculture, and how appropriate that the shrine itself is a garden. So I think Adasiya is actually an interesting example for our times. So the Adasiya example provides a relevant example of just, productive, and sustainable rural development, applicable to 1/3 of humanity, the smallholder farmers who produce much of the world's food. In fact, the development principles followed by Abdu'l-Bahá addressed a range of social and ecological concerns that have since intensified. The development of Adasiya accomplished 3 things that, if replicated, would greatly contribute to the development of rural areas in the world today. So the village provided ecological and climate services. With the encouragement of Abdu'l-Bahá, the community of Adasiya restored degraded, eroded, and deforested land, improved soil quality, improved water use efficiency, and increased crop diversity, including the use of perennial tree crops and forages. Today, this approach, which requires minimal external inputs, is known as agroecology, or regenerative farming, an effort to farm in a manner that mimics the functions of natural ecosystems. We also see social economic development principles involved here. The initial capital investment by Abdu'l-Bahá was the catalyst that allowed families in Adasiya to prosper. They were able to transform scrubland into a productive farm that eventually supported hundreds of residents and contributed to the local and regional economy. The farm provided high quality food for the village and urban areas. The generous sharecropping arrangement and profit sharing improved the standard of living of residents and non-resident farm laborers alike. So we see that actually, in this case, restoring the ecological functions actually led to higher levels of prosperity. And the third thing then is capacity building, including moral capacity. Material self-reliance brings a sense of dignity. Abdu'l-Bahá went further, encouraging the residents of Adasiya to pay equal attention to their moral development. This was achieved through education, both material and spiritual, for the children, youth, and adults, and through a regular devotional meeting, having regular devotional meetings. Education supported a dual moral purpose to develop the potentialities of the individual and to enhance their capacity to be of service. Building this capacity helped community members to live harmoniously. A local governing institution was elected to administer the material and spiritual needs of the community. In this way, the moral capacity of the individuals, the community, and the institutions increased. So again, 3 really important aspects or lessons that we can apply today in the world. We'll just go into that a little bit more, why this is so significant. So this is a really critical concern, is the need for village development today. Although we see ourselves in the kind of industrial technological era, the fact is that much of the world is still directly engaged in agriculture in villages and as smallholder farmers. So it's interesting that farming today remains the single largest occupation, and 1/3 of humanity, about 2.5 billion farmers and their families, derive their livelihoods from agriculture. There are about 500 million farms worldwide, but also 200 million pastoralists, people who graze sheep and goats and so on, and 450 million farm laborers. And up to 1.75 billion people derive at least some of their subsistence or income from forests, including some 60 million indigenous peoples. And another 58 million people are engaged in fisheries and aquaculture, and as many as 800 million people involved in urban and peri-urban food production. So, although we kind of have shifted to a more urbanized society, that doesn't mean that rural life is no longer very significant. Of course, it's kind of the foundation for our economy. Now, the methods which I mentioned that Abdu'l-Bahá had employed can now be described as agroecology. And experiments in agroecology around the world is showing that it can boost productivity by about 50 to 100%. So this activity on smallholder farms is extremely beneficial. And the potential to restore the ecosphere in the way that it was done in Odisea, where the land was very degraded, is really important. There's estimated about 3.5 billion hectares of land degraded, which is approximately the size of Africa. And supporting the rural poor to restore these lands has huge potential to eliminate extreme poverty and hunger. Most of the very, very poor people and people who experience extreme hunger are actually the rural poor. So helping them to improve their way of life, to become more productive, is really an important aspect of limiting poverty. While doing this, you would actually be increasing biocapacity, so the capacity of the earth to support a growing population by improving agroecosystems. This is one of the best ways to ameliorate climate change, because you're taking a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and you're using these systems, you're putting it into plants and into the soil organic matter, soil organic carbon. And also this would help to avoid this problem of mass migrations. So huge number of people, today they're talking about something like 60 to 80 million people are migrating because of either poverty or ecological disasters in their home countries. So by helping these people to improve their lives at the village level, this is another thing that can be avoided. And so by doing this, by restoring this much land, potentially over time, it would be possible to essentially be like creating an entire new continent of land that could support human development and a new ever-advancing civilization. So many Baha'is around the world are following in the footsteps of the Master. These are Baha'is in Mongolia who were starting agricultural projects. In Mongolia, people were almost entirely dependent on animal products, and there was a certain level of malnutrition because of this. So the Baha'is there were encouraging growing different types of vegetables to balance the diet. And some of this work goes back a long time. This is a picture from 1928 when the man of the trees, Richard St. Barbaker, who was an early Baha'i, was traveling in Africa and encouraging rural development through agroecology and these progressive farming systems that employed the use of tree cover. So this goes back a long time, Baha'is being engaged in this process. And Richard St. Barbaker started this group, the International Tree Foundation. It used to be called the Men of the Trees. till they figured out that women were doing most of the tree planting. And they changed the name, and it's still active today, planting millions of trees in Africa and other places. Organizations like Fundayak in Colombia and working in different parts of Latin America especially, but also in spreading the kind of concepts that they use to different parts of the world, and trying to build successful models for village development that are based on the Baha'i teachings, and also science and the exploration of workable alternatives. Here's the Center for Rural Wellbeing in Colombia, where Baha'is are working on agricultural plots. The Barley Institute for Rural Women in India, and started in 1985 by the National Spiritual Assembly of India, and training thousands of young women to go back to their villages and support development processes in agriculture and other fields. I like this example. It's quite pertinent of how this local spiritual assembly in Nepal, trying to deal with many agricultural workers who had been displaced due to the pandemic, and they had worked with them to find a land to grow their own food in their community. So spiritual assemblies taking initiative in these areas as well in many parts of the world. But also here in let's say the United States or different parts of the wealthier countries, many Baha'is are getting involved at things like community gardens, working with children's classes and youth to make this part of Baha'i life, and at the same time building these bonds of friendship and cooperation within communities. And just a few other examples. I love these examples of Baha'is engaged in coral restoration projects in fishing villages in Fiji, and now kind of looking at the whole watershed in island communities and how they can be restored. As Smallholder Farmers Alliance in Haiti, which is Baha'i inspired and based on the work of Richard St. Barbe Baker, where they've planted millions of trees. They have 3,200 small farmers working together, and they have developed an innovative system of tree currency, which gives people incentives to incorporate tree farming as part of their agricultural operations. I like this, and when they were building the house of worship in Norte del Cauca in Colombia, the community decided to restore a native forest to accompany the construction of the house of worship, and went to the elders and learned how to restore these native forests that were highly productive of food. So this is another exciting example of things Baha'is are doing, following the footsteps of the master. Yeah, and I'll end here with these quotes. The Lord of all mankind hath fashioned this human realm to be a garden of Eden, an earthly paradise. If, as it must, it findeth the way to harmony and peace, to love and mutual trust, it will become a true abode of bliss, a place of manifold blessings and unending delight. Therein shall be revealed the excellence of humankind. Therein shall the rays of the Sun of Truth shine forth on every hand. And from the Guardian's quotation from the Baha'u'llah, a race of men is his written promise, incomparable in character, shall be raised up, which with the feet of detachment will tread under all who are in heaven and earth, and will cast the sleeve of holiness over all that has been created from water and clay. So some beautiful promises of what's in store for us in the future. And I think if we all work together, modeling ourselves on Abdu'l-Bahá, that future may come sooner rather than later. So thank you very much. I'll stop my sharing, and hopefully that stimulates some questions and consultation.
We do have quite a few interesting questions. Thank you so much, Paul. Very, very important and interesting presentation. You brought Adesiyah to life. It was incredible. Thank you. We have a question here. Would you have a source for the statement on the slaves owned by Baha'u'llah's father and the release by him?
Yeah, that came from talks that are by Nadar Saidi, and he does a talk, one of the Baha'i Studies conferences, it's called something like, from oppression to freedom or something like that. So if you look up the talks of Dr. Saidi in the Association of Baha'i Studies website, and it's also published as an article in the Baha'i Studies Journal. And so in that, he talks about all the forms of oppression that the Baha'i teachings are working to overcome. And he starts out by talking about the freeing of the slaves by Baha'u'llah, I think in 1837. So before even the Bab's revelation, he was already doing that. And he said that he himself was only a slave. So how could a slave own a slave? And I think there's actually tablets of Baha'u'llah from that time, before even his revelation started, about that.
Thank you. Is the Haziratul Quds still there today? The Adasiyah?
I'm not sure. My son for a while lived in Jordan, and we drove down to that area of where Adasiyah was, and now it's actually quite a verdant area of farmland and all tree covered and so on. But they told us we couldn't go in there just because of local politics and so on. And as I mentioned, the Baha'i community there had to disband in around 1960 because of land reforms. So whether that building still exists, I don't know. And I think there are some Baha'is that still live in the area, but I can't say too much about that.
Wasn't that the land that Shoghi Effendi gave away to the government so he could buy the land around his shrine?
I don't think so.
Shrine of Baha'u'llah?
I think that's a different place, but don't quote me. Actually, there was a final slide, which I think I failed to show, which showed some of the sources. So Raj Pushti's original article, you can find it if you search. It's in a Baha'i Studies journal. Should I just put that back up there again? And then there's also an article that I wrote for Baha'i World, which is anybody can access the Baha'i World book that Shoghi Effendi started, is now an online publication. So there's an article that starts, I think it's called Begin with the Village. So it tells this whole story, and it has references and so on. But I'll just try and find those and put them, those links, and put them into the chat box.
Okay, we have a question here. You have described how a village-centered development model can help throughout the developing world. In the United States, the recent census shows that the population has shifted even more to cities and suburbs, with only 15% as rural population. Do you see a way for this village model to stem or even reverse this urbanization? Do you see ways to apply these same principles to sustainable urban systems?
Yeah, I think, the way I see it is the House of Justice is kind of helping people to kind of refocus on the idea of neighborhoods. They talk about villages and then they talk about neighborhoods. So I don't know, I'm imagining in the future that as we make more and more efforts to both build stronger sense of community, but also deal with the questions of environmental damage and build more sustainable systems, we're going to become more and more focused at the neighborhood level. And I sort of imagine, and this is based on some thinking about urbanization and urban systems, that places will become much more focused into a neighborhood level where people will work and live in the same neighborhood. Perhaps urban farming will become more and more of a force, as it already is in many locations. And there's really some interesting things about how much urban agriculture contributes to the food supply in many parts of the world. So, I think there is potential to apply some of these concepts in urban areas as well. For example, Abdu'l-Bahá talks about the village storehouse, and he describes this whole kind of concept. And I think he says, oh no, this isn't sort of an exact prescription. This just is giving you an idea of what we could do working together to kind of create a community development bank. And why couldn't that apply also to at the neighborhood level in urban areas? I think there's a lot of potential for that to happen. Hope that sort of gives you some idea of what's possible there.
Where can we find more about the connection between Adasi and the kibbutz system?
Yeah, okay, I've put in 2 links into the chat box. One is an article I wrote called Begin with the Village. The other one is the original article on Adasiya by Raj Prushti. Then I mentioned this, I'm just going to go back and find his name again. He would actually be a really interesting person to give a talk sometime, and he has offered, where did I put that? There's an Israeli researcher, Dr. Shay Rosen, and he did a talk for a fireside in England. There was a kind of a fireside series, and he gave a talk for them, and which is recorded. But if you Google Dr. Shay Rosen, and you might be able to find it. I'm just trying to remember the title of this fireside series in England. But anyways, he's the person who researched this, and he had a in-depth research about all these Baha'i villages. There's more than one, but he knew intimately and had all kinds of interesting pictures of Baha'i ceremonies at Adasiya and so on that kibbutz people attended. And yeah, it's the Ozzy Whitehead fireside. Somebody put that, Jane put that into the chat box. So if you Googled Ozzy, O-Z, or Z, I guess you Americans say, Whitehead firesides, you'll probably find that, and his name is Dr. Shay Rosen.
All right, the next question, is there a contact list for those of us who may want to assist with the Baha'i International Agricultural Development?
There are several groups who are pursuing this. I'm just trying to, sometimes I can't think of the names of them, sorry. But there are probably during this thing, it'll pop in my mind and I'll put it in the chat box. But there are several groups associated with, for example, Association of Baha'i Studies. There's a special interest group that deals with agriculture, and they have, series of talks and different things going on all around the world. So yeah, there are opportunities to connect with other Baha'is interested in these themes. Agricultural Working Group, that's what it's called. So if you Googled Agricultural Working Group Baha'i, you would find them and could make connections with them.
Is that through ABS?
Yeah.
Please share again why agriculture elevated in the writings to more than just any other technical issue, like furniture making, for example, or any other branch of technology.
The way I see it is there's several ways of looking at it, but I think if we kind of strip our life down to the foundations, the bare minimum, what do we all need more than anything else? And it's food. So food and water and air. So I think, you know, this is kind of the form of primary production using living systems, and pretty well everything else is all other kinds of industries use non-living systems. So it's kind of a unique thing, and it's a primary form of production. So I think it becomes central. But also there's other things to think about, like think about food and how significant it is culturally, how it brings people together. Like, you know, what do we do as families? We come together, we feed the children, we sit around the table, we connect with each other. What do we do when we have community gatherings? We have potluck suppers, we have festivals that focus around food. Food is something that really brings people together. And even, you know, in the Baha'i faith, the 19-day feast, I mean, I realize it's mainly a spiritual feast, but there's also that element of providing refreshments and so on, which helps to build community. So there's so many physical, practical, but also cultural significances to food that make it somehow special. So yeah, I mean, I think we can all give some thought to that. Why did Baha'u'llah give this prominence over things like education, making peace, when he said this is the of first importance?
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Could you elaborate about your system presentation with agriculture at the center?
That system map that I created, I could put that into the chat box too, if I can find the link. But yeah, I identified maybe something like 100, I think it's 115 different elements that I thought were very relevant to the global food system, to agriculture. And so I'm kind of building this map, and it's a work in progress, but I want to link every point in the map to a specific writings. That's kind of my next step. So I think sometimes to kind of understand things, creating a visualization like a mapping process like that can be really helpful to kind of see the complexity of the transformative process that Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá have provided for us. So, you know, people talk about a systems approach, and if you want to get profound change to occur, you have to really address all the different elements of the system. So, you know, we have to address the education of children and helping them learn about food systems, but we also have to address the international community and international markets and so on. So there's this huge range of different things that have to be considered in building new food systems. I thought it was really interesting this week because the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out with a new report, and some people may have seen it, and it's very, very disturbing. But one of the scientists involved in it, who is a leading scientist in the United Kingdom, he came out with an article, and he talked about how the only way that we can proceed is through transformative change. And so I thought that was very interesting that, you know, this concept of the Baha'u'llah talked about the object of every revelation being to bring about this inner and outer transformation. And now in this scientific terms, they're starting to talk about the only way we can really look at successfully resolving these problems is to really look at transformative system change. So this is now, I think these, I guess we could say the greater plan of God, which is about the different workings of the world and all of the changes that are occurring, including things like the changing climate is really eventually wakes us up to the need for this inner spiritual work and the work of building the stronger bonds, connection between people all over the world. So these forces work together, the greater plan of God and the lesser plan of God that we're involved in bringing about. So yeah, I think there's kind of these horrible things that are happening worldwide. We were talking about it earlier before we started, the fires and the floods and so on. But they are creating a consciousness in people, and so hopefully we'll see this kind of transformative change deepening all over the world, and we're seeing it in some places already, for sure.
Is there any discussion in the writings of harvesting products from uncultivated areas? An example would be tropical or other forests.
I don't think so. I don't see that directly in the writings, but perhaps indirectly. You know, one of the things that's really interesting is now the emergence of the idea of indigenous knowledge. So indigenous people in many places were more, you know, gathered from natural systems. And, you know, some places they had highly developed farming systems, but in others they used, you know, worked with existing ecosystems without cultivation. And so there's a real interest in this indigenous knowledge. And of course, it's interesting that Abdu'l-Bahá talked about indigenous people in the tablets, the divine plan, and how indigenous people would become, in the Americas, would become the light to the world. So I don't know, just is there a connection there? I kind of tend to think so. I was involved with a group back in Canada that received the Rockefeller Foundation's Food System Vision Prize. And what we tried to do is look at the sort of issue of colonization and decolonization, and could we create a food system that was decolonized, that kind of used the indigenous knowledge of the First Nations in our area, in the prairies of Canada, to kind of build a new food system. And we outlined that and created systems maps that tried to bring all these elements together. And that was recognized. And the 10 winners around the world of the Food System Vision Prize, most of them actually were linking to indigenous knowledge and indigenous food systems. So there is this very important link. And you know, it's, I guess if you read the writings in a certain way, perhaps you would see that kind of link. Just speculation on my part.
Well, what about the Green Wall project in Africa? Are there any Baha'is involved in that?
Well, this the Great Green Wall that's being built in African nations to kind of block the southern movement of the Sahara Desert into the Sahel region was actually initially proposed by Richard St. Barbe Baker, who was a Baha'i, in the 1950s. And when he spent a great deal of time over several decades trying to encourage people to build that. And it would be, if it was built, his idea was it would be about 20 miles wide and run all the way across Africa, so several thousand miles in length. And when they actually decided to do that in maybe about 10 years ago, there was an article in the London Times that credited St. Barbe Baker for developing this concept. So different countries are working on that, and it is coming into place. One of the people that has been very successful in desert reclamation in Niger was inspired by Richard St. Barbe Baker. His name is Tony Renato, and he worked with the local farmers to develop forest regeneration in desert areas, and they regenerated something like 6 million hectares, which is apparently something like the size of Costa Rica. So yeah, there's been some very successful efforts by people who are inspired by Baha'is, at least. And hopefully, you know, the Baha'i communities in those areas are also involved. I don't know.
Do you have a website, Paul, where some of this information can be found?
I've got websites. There's a book that I wrote called 11, and we have a website and a Facebook page. I don't really use it that much anymore, but if you just Google 11 by Paul Hanley, you'd find it. And, you know, some of these things are discussed in that book in depth, but they're not so much attributed to Baha'i sources, but there is some attribution. And there's also a book called Spirit of Agriculture, which is published by George Ronald. And so some of this is going into details. There are 13 people who wrote articles for that book, including myself. And so one of the articles is kind of a survey of the Baha'i writings on agriculture. So you can get quite a few of the ideas that are in this presentation and in that systems map that I showed you are in that article called This Vital and Important Matter. And that's also available now as an ebook. So you can get that for, you know, a few dollars. And the books about Richard St. Barbe Baker, one of them is published by the Bellwood Press, which is an imprint of the Baha'i Publishing Trust in the US. So that's the children's book. And then there's the other book, which is published by University of Regina Press. So those give you the story, the story of one Baha'i who made really heroic efforts to alert the world to these environmental conditions that we're facing.
The last two questions. Interesting one. How to develop a taste for new foods, such as insects, feral hogs, invasive fish, such as lionfish?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of working on that because I moved from Saskatchewan to Hawaii, and I've always been a gardener, but I'm finding certain stuff that I always used to growing won't really grow here. And people are saying, well, just grow the things that grow here. So I have to look at things like breadfruit and taro and so on, and how can we use those. Interesting, I just encountered this fellow, there's a story in the press here about this guy. His name is Vince Dodge, and he is working on commercializing flour made from the pods of the kiave tree, which is an invasive species here. And it's grown here for about 200 years now, and it's kind of taken over the islands. But it turns out it's a very nutritious food, this pod. And one of the interesting things about it is the hotter it is, the better it grows. So he's realizing that this is be very good species in terms of climate change as the things get hotter. And so he's developed it. And then I found out that he's a Baha'i. So that was really interesting.
Do you have a link or source to learn more about the indigenous food systems and your work with Rockefeller Foundation?
Yeah, again, if you Googled Food System Vision Prize, Rockefeller Foundation, something like that, you would find all the prize winners, and you know, ours is called Quayas Castaso and Wokotoan, which is a Cree term that means making things right by recognizing the relatedness of all things. And so, yeah, you'll find, and there are 10 different prize winners, so they're all really interesting. There's another one that's spearheaded by a Baha'i, which is in Lima, Peru. and they're developing a system of harvesting water out of the air and then bringing it down to irrigate crops, because Lima is a desert city, and so it's very innovative concept. So yeah, just concepts going from around the world. So it's, yeah, Food System Vision Prize. I'll get you there.
So another question just popped up. What do you think about mushrooms?
They're good.
They're good.
Yeah, there's a whole sort of discourse about mushrooms and how potentially different types of mushroom and fungus are really critical to resolving many ecological problems and creating sustainable soils and forests and so on. So yeah, that's a whole area. I don't know a lot about, but I've seen there's many books now on that topic.
All right, thank you. We're done with the questions. Very interesting, timely topic. Very scary as well. Thank you so much, Paul.
Thank you so much, Paul. Yes, and thank you also to SFA. I had to send a message to all the Green Acre staff here. I'm like, you guys might want to get on this webinar. I'm learning all kinds of amazing things about Abdu'l-Bahá. Just the way that you literally listed out all of the different things that he was able to accomplish is mind-blowing. Just I don't understand how it's possible. And also these villages that he helped to raise up, and I think so often we don't know what's possible until we see it in action, and he helped us with that long ago. So thank you for bringing that reality to our awareness so that it expands our understanding of what is possible. And I think there's a lot of us who have a longing to live in harmony with the land and with each other, and we're not seeing many examples of that around us. So thank you for showcasing that.
And Paul, you might want to take a look at all the chat comments, and everybody is thanking you and saying that it was a wonderful talk and they learned a lot from it.
Oh yeah, I saw that. Thanks so much. I really appreciate that. And I just wanted to highlight this one. Somebody had said, quoting Bill Mollison, the problem is the solution. And I think there's a lot to that. So we shouldn't be discouraged. The House of Justice talks about the Baha'is have to be always fundamentally assured and happy. So, we're in a difficult time in history, but we have to somehow be the hope for the world. So there's lots of, many good things are happening, and we also need to focus on that. So thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful day, and hopefully we'll see you in a Zoom square, if not in person one day.
Okay.
Bye,
Aloha.
Thank you.
Aloha and aloha.
Aloha.
Aloha and aloha.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.